Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss the momentum building for the removal of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister by MPs in his own party. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, the next stage in Boris Johnson's inevitable removal from power begins. It was pretty clear that his MPs would have to have got rid of him as soon as the polls showed Labour closing in on the Conservatives in terms of approval and voting intentions. And this is without Labour having to do anything other than to shine a spotlight on government failures. It's one thing for Johnson's personal approval ratings to be shot. That's on him, and stop being a problem for the party the instant that they jettison him. But as I've mentioned before, if they allow Labour to overtake the Conservatives, they'll have to start putting in a lot of work into winning back the public to reverse that trend. Now, without this, if the country were just personally upset with Boris Johnson, they could hold on to him for another year or so. And this is what I think they'd have personally preferred. I've said as much on a few occasions, but the talk has been more and more of having to get rid of him earlier. Now, Tory MPs were speaking in hushed tones about how useless he's been during the coronavirus pandemic. But now the Daily Mail, which is a far right-wing paper in the UK, has said that Tory MPs have been telling them quite openly about the talk to get rid of him. And this, if true, would be a new phase. It's not quite open rebellion yet. We haven't got a situation where MPs are happy to be recorded saying these things. That would come later. But if MPs no longer care about being caught demonstrating a lack of confidence in the leadership, you've begun to wonder how many more MPs agree but are still keeping their thoughts to themselves. And once the talk becomes open, it then becomes an issue of when, not whether. One thing that I personally found odd, though, has been the constant references to the idea that Boris Johnson seems to have lost his mojo since his COVID illness. And it keeps cropping up and up and up. And it links to an interesting, though I think flawed article that I was reading in the New European. So it talked about the fact that you've got all these right-wing newspapers that backed Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister last year and will now find it difficult in the face of that to attack him. Now, I don't think that's the case, because the only papers that are not already savaging Boris Johnson's leadership have been The Sun and The Express. All these other papers that backed him a year ago have savaged him since. Some will do it on an almost daily basis. The media have no problem saying one thing one day and then the opposite thing the next day. They know their readers have short-term memories, or if they don't really care, even if they do remember the counter position. But the references to his illness are interesting, because maybe that's a bit of a sign that some MPs will use it as an excuse for backing him in 2019 and sacking him in 2020. Because although the media don't mind U-turning at the drop of a hat, because who's going to point it out? They're the media. MPs do. He isn't different. Boris Johnson is no different now to how he was a year ago or 10 years ago. Everything about his response right now is classic Boris Johnson. He was always this lazy and stupid. He just didn't have the combination of a genuine crisis and an effective opposition leader to highlight it quite so clearly. But it's not the newspapers who will remove Boris Johnson. They can put pressure on him. It's his own MPs. They're the only ones who have the power. Questions will be asked. At the point at which open rebellion happens, questions will be asked, and it is an easy answer to say that you supported Boris Johnson before because he was absolutely the right man to take us through these challenges. But do you know what? Ever since the illness, it seems to have weakened him. He's just not the same person anymore. Towards the end of a relationship where one partner may say, well, they weren't like this at the start. No, they were. You just didn't want to admit it. The groundwork is already being laid. In order to head off criticism of his handling of the coronavirus affair, there has been a suggestion that there will be a September reshuffle. Cabinet ministers seen to have failed will be removed. So the reports go. But that being said, there were reports that said there was a reshuffle far more imminently, the end of this month in fact. But I have no doubt that Johnson would like to throw some cabinet colleagues, particularly ones he thinks he can get away with, under the bus in order to deflect blame from himself. Classic case saying to the public, yeah, you're right, our response wasn't what it should have been. It's their fault. I'm getting rid of them because I'm a strong leader. And sometimes it is not an unreasonable thing to do. For example, yesterday I spoke about the fact that the Department for Education has at no point had a plan for the reopening of schools, other than to say schools should reopen. No guidance on how to solve the practical problems. They just defer responsibility to individual schools and colleges. That is a failure of the Education Secretary, and he has indeed been touted as a possible sacking. After all, he's quite an easy one to sack. He doesn't have a lot of clout in the party. But in truth, cabinet ministers have no power to actually do anything. They should. But a feature of Boris Johnson's government is that he has centralised all decision making. Cabinet ministers are told what to do. They're not allowed to work out what to do. Cabinet ministers are supposed to come up with policy ideas. No, they're told what to do. And initiative is not required for their jobs under Boris Johnson. Just as well, when you consider that in the entire cabinet, only 2 of them have demonstrated any competence at all, Robert Buckland and Rishi Sunak. And Conservative MPs have bemoaned the centralisation of decision making in the party, in government. So they won't be fooled by such measures. Of course, their chief concern is the approval ratings. If Boris Johnson carries out a reshuffle that seems to get the public back on board, and he probably can wait till September, because, there's another, 5 or 6 weeks before summer, then they'll break for summer. They shouldn't. They absolutely shouldn't. It's a disgrace that Parliament will not be sitting in the middle of a massive crisis. But at the end of the day, the government don't want Parliament sitting, and they will order their MPs not to vote for, to carry on sitting over summer. So they will break for summer. And he'll be fine. They're not going to get rid of him in the next month or 2. So then when he come back end of August, early September, a reshuffle, then, maybe he'll feel that he can use that to get some public support back for him. And if it works, then those talks of rebellion will subside for a little bit. They will subside for a bit. Of course, then it'll be back into PMQs and it'll start going south again. There we go. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, there was an interesting quote in the Mail that also pointed out why it may be taking so long to deal with the issue, because you could argue an awful lot of damage has already been done. So they quoted one MP as saying, "It's been difficult for people to get organised because everyone's been scattered around the country. But the conversations are taking place now. There's a feeling the basic level of competence isn't there in number 10. Devastating if this is a widely held view in the Parliamentary Conservative Party. And it also explains the timescale, because rebellion, of course, begins in the shadows. A lot of people may think that he's unsuitable, but who do they dare talk to it? Tory MPs? Do I trust my Tory colleagues? Do I, L? So it begins in the shadows. You start to talk to a couple of people that you sort of trust. Nobody wants to stick their head above the parapet if they don't know that a lot of people are of the same mind. Not easy to have hushed conversations remotely. Someone might record it. And I suppose it's also possible that the large number of brand new Conservative MPs, basically 100 new Conservative MPs, many of whom did not expect to win. They won in areas they wouldn't have expected to win. And they're not attuned to the realities of backroom politicking and good old-fashioned skullduggery of the type needed for a leadership rebellion. And this may be where the decision to get MPs physically back to Parliament is a bit of a government-owned goal, because it's the government that forced MPs to physically return when they could have done it perfectly well remotely. It has allowed those MPs to have those conversations in person where they feel a bit safer, ironically. And another quote related to the latest U-turn on free school meals, which was very illuminating. I had not considered this. So this quote was, what lay at the heart of all that was that no one trusts number 10 to hold the line on anything anymore. No one's going to go out and fight for a policy, even if it's the right policy, because they think when the heat is on, they'll fold. And this sentiment can't be overstated. Again, if a lot of MPs are feeling this, cannot be overstated. Because if an MP toeing the party line promotes an unpopular policy, they take a hit in terms of credibility in the local constituency. But if the policy is enforced, especially early on in a parliament, there's a chance it's all forgotten about by the election. Not when the government abandons the policy, because then your local MP just looks like a tit, and it can be used even years later against them. The reason is this, because if a party backs their leadership, and that leadership has to see it through and prove that the policy was not as harmful as suggested, because that sometimes happens, even if it's a terrible policy, if you can convince the majority of people, well, it didn't screw your life over, did it? So it can't have been that bad. And people go, yeah, it didn't turn out that bad. That's fine. But if you abandon the policy, it will always be a bad policy in people's minds. Terrible policy. And that local MP, because they backed it, they will forever, have that on them. So people, even years later, will say, you backed that terrible policy. They don't get to say it wasn't actually that terrible, because they'll say, your own party leadership went back on it. That's it. With the policy abandoned, it always remains unpopular, and that MP will always remain one of those that backed it. Fatal. So I can well understand how backbench MPs, next time the government asks them to back an unpopular policy, let's say, I don't know, refusing to pay the final year student nurses who were offered a contract to do some work for COVID, might be inclined to go, I'm not going to support that, because when the heat is on, you'll just fold anyway, and I look like a dickhead. So there it is. It could well be that momentum really does gather on this, and after summer, I wouldn't expect anything before summer. Maybe after summer, particularly if it's a bad summer, there could be heightened calls for him to be removed before even the end of the year. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.